Who is a true neighbor? In Luke chapter 10 verses 29 to 37, we learn the two greatest commandments given by Jesus. The previous week, we are commanded to love God with all our heart, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. And Jesus tells us to do this and we will live. Excessive emphasis on justification by faith, which provides salvation through faith, has led to limitations in personalizing the gospel. This is a serious distortion of the gospel. As a result, our problem today lies in our lack of interest in our neighbors and society. The core of the problem lies in the lack of the gospel, the emptiness of the gospel, and it comes from limiting the gospel to a personal level. Jesus gives us two greatest commandments and emphasizes obedience by saying, "Do this, and you will live." And today's message is also a continuation of the previous week's message. Today's scripture is Luke 1029 to 37. In the text, there is a great contrast between the actions of the priest, the Levite, and a certain Samaritan. Priests and Levites are people who know the law very well and refer to today's pastors. And Samaritans are the people Jews despise and ignore the most. Through a scholar of law's question, we learn many lessons from a person who was nearly killed by a robber on the road to Jericho, and from a neighbor who is in desperate need of help. Part 1. Teachings from the actions of the priest and Levite. The priest and Levite were those who studied the book of law and performed their duties from a young age, and thus knew the law better than anyone else. They knew very well that they had to help their neighbors in need. However, when they were in a situation where they had to help a person who had been robbed, they turned away. Why? First, the law is interpreted literally according to custom. Priest and Levite had Jewish religious status. They held a respected position in Jewish society, and therefore prioritized the responsibilities of their position and role. According to Jewish law and custom, it was considered that contact with an unclean person who was bleeding would defile one's purity. Therefore, the priest and Levite may have passed by to avoid providing help to an unclean person. They did not know the spirit of the law, and committed the foolishness of interpreting the law literally. Second, they are self-centered, selfish people. The priest and Levite wanted to prioritize their own interests and comfort. They believed that helping a robber could jeopardize their own safety, so they took a self-protective attitude. They did not know the spirit of the law, and committed the foolishness of interpreting the law literally. They knew very well Scripture, which is to love their neighbor as themselves, but they did not understand the law accordingly and properly. So, they did not have the faith to act with compassion and love for their neighbors. Part 2. Teachings from the actions of the Samaritan. But the Samaritan, whom the Jews so ignored and despised, acted differently in comparison with the priest and Levite when he encountered a person robbed and dying. In 33 to 35, a certain Samaritan, as he was traveling, came there and saw him and had compassion on him. He went up to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. He put him on his animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "This man, take care of it. If you spend more, I will repay you when I return." It can be assumed that the person who was robbed and dying was Jewish, but the person who helped him was a Samaritan whom they despised so much. This shows that Jesus intended to emphasize the teachings about loving one's neighbor through this excessive parable, and to allow it to be interpreted from various perspectives. First, it is a universal and common principle regarding loving neighbors. This parable raises the question on perspective: who is neighbors? Jesus seeks to extend the concept of neighbor to all people beyond social boundaries. such as race, religion, and social status. Therefore, the Samaritan's actions can be interpreted as a parable showing Jesus' general principle of loving one's neighbors. Additionally, the Samaritan transcended his conflicts with his Jews and social expectations, and faithfully fulfilled his moral obligations. This shows that mercy and love must come first in moral behavior in any situation. Second, it is a revolutionary message about loving one's neighbors. Considering the social background of the time, it was not socially expected for a Samaritan to help a Jew. Considering this historical background, the Samaritan's actions can also be interpreted as expressing Jesus' revolutionary message about love for one's neighbors. Therefore, rather than explaining the Samaritan's actions as an excessive and unreasonable parable, it is appropriate to understand it as a parable that emphasizes Jesus' deep teachings about loving one's neighbors. Part 3, Teachings we must learn. Priest and Levite put forth laws and customs in urgent situations, when help was needed, and with a selfish and self-centered interpretation, the person who was robbed and dying was ignored. We can see that they are unsaved. People who did not follow Jesus' words, "Do this, and you will live." The situation was not good. This is a situation where you can run into trouble at any time, while helping others in some obscure place in Jericho. However, the Samaritan's actions make it inexcusable. This is what Jesus says to us. What is their problem of the priest and Levite above? In short, we can see that these people did not know the grace of God. Jesus also said that when he encountered a neighbor who had been robbed, the priest and Levite had no love or compassion for the neighbor. This ignorance led them to become selfish and self-centered in their interpretation of the law. Jesus wants us to know the grace of sinners given, so that we can care for our neighbors. In Luke chapter 7 verses 41 to 50, it is a parable about the grace of a person whose debt is forgiven. It also praises the devotion and faith of the woman who poured perfume and washed Jesus' feet. There is also criticism of the Pharisee, the host who invited the guest. We can see Jesus wanting everyone to know the grace of sinners. Why does Jesus want us to know this grace? This is because, if you do not know the grace of God, you cannot have a heart of love and compassion toward God and toward your neighbors. Therefore, only those who have received grace, and those who realize this grace can truly love their neighbors. We have been made righteous through the merits of Jesus Christ. When we are justified, God demands nothing more from us, because the righteousness that God has achieved, the righteousness that he gives us as a gift, this righteousness refers to the goodwill and favor that God gives toward sinners. We are given God's righteousness by God's grace. This is the gospel. In the New Testament, the concept of dikaiosune, the Greek word for justice of God, does not refer to human virtue and goodwill, but refers to the righteous status of a Christian who has been recognized as righteous before God. This means fully carrying out all obligations to God and humans, and is an expression of maintaining a perfect relationship. What happens if you know this grace? This is because we must think about the life that Christians who have received forgiveness of sins through the gift of God's grace, and have the righteousness of God should pursue. Augustine explains this as a concept based on the gift of God's grace, rather than a legalistic belief that sees it as a duty given to us. Therefore, beyond the level of personal salvation, Christians must become debtors to the grace of Jesus, and live a life that demonstrates acts of faith in their daily lives, representing the socially underprivileged and loving their neighbors as themselves. If we go back to the text of the Bible, in 36, in your opinion, which of these three would be the neighbor of the man who fell into the hands of robbers. Therefore, Christians go beyond personal salvation and become debtors to the grace of Jesus, representing the socially disadvantaged in their daily lives and loving their neighbors as themselves. You must live a life where your actions are revealed. This is the duty that saved Christians, who have received Jesus' commandments, must practice. Jesus previously declared, "Do this, and you will live." The duty of saved Christians is to love God and love their neighbors. It is to fulfill our responsibility as light and salt in the world. In verse 37, he said to him, "The one who showed mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." Just as Jesus gave instructions the previous week, he gives the same command in today's text. Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." We need to recognize the truly poor who need care, and our neighbors who need help. At times like this, we can provide practical help to our neighbors in need. And now, as an alternative, Tim Keller's Ministries of Mercy. The Call of the Jericho Road explains the practice of mercy ministry in detail, about how we can be good neighbors. The author recommends that each person develop their own ministry of mercy. He talks about individuals, families, volunteer organizations, and the nation as the 4 channels of practicing mercy. And as mentioned in Tim Keller's book, he recommends starting where you are now. And as the author says, we need to start by training ourselves to give a warm smile, greeting, and facial expression even when we coincidentally encounter the typical attitude shown by neighbors.